All right, guys, I'm going to dive into the 10 top disciple making mistakes, starting with underestimating the worship service dilemma. So, one of the problems I mentioned is that there is widespread disobedience when it comes to Jesus's clear command to go and make disciples. And I think one of the reasons is that if you asked people, is there something that if you stop doing would make you feel like you're not really a Christian? In other words, you're not really following Jesus. And for 95% of Western Christians, the thing that would cause them to feel like they're not properly obeying Jesus is if they did not attend a worship service that week, or consistently. Somehow, the clear, direct command to make disciples does not rise to the level of causing us to realize that we're in disobedience. But not attending a worship service does create that feeling for most Christians. I think this creates a real dilemma for disciple making, because what often happens is that people, whether they do it on purpose, and I think many pastors try to combat this problem as well, but generally speaking, people believe there is a religious culture that we are dealing with that says that attending a worship service is at some level the foundational essence of what it means to follow Jesus, and we have to work through that intuition that we have. It doesn't mean there's anything wrong with attending worship services. It's just odd that this one particular practice has somehow been elevated to the primacy within our context. So much so that people often, once they are achieving that, kind of sit back and become quite passive. And so we're going to talk a lot about that challenge. Another one that I mentioned is that there is a widespread belief that discipleship should be purely organic. Now, Jesus didn't practice it this way. He called individual people to be discipled. He named them. There was at least 100 people following him when he chose the 12. We're given even the way that Jesus chose them, that he went to a mountain to pray all night and then called these 12 people. And then, of course, he also had a group of 3 that he was very focused on. But today, a lot of people, they just are like, hey, discipleship just happens organically. It just happens naturally. You don't need to be intentional about it. I do not believe that that rises to the level of being true discipleship. So we're going to talk about that. We believe that's a mistake. One of the huge challenges that we face is, in our context in particular, people believe that you have to be at a certain level of maturity to make disciples. I told the story about Dawson Trotman and the first person he discipled. And after, discipling him for 6 to 12 months, this man named Spencer, Dawson released him to begin the process of disciple making. Now, overseas, people really take this on as well and feel comfortable making disciples. But in the West, we have almost a bias towards, maybe if after I'm a believer for 20 or 30 years, I'll be mature enough to pass on the lessons or the things that I've received and disciple somebody else. This has caused that is the end of multiplication if the bar is that high. And oftentimes in the course we'll talk about the challenge of I think that the question we ask the wrong question. Western people tend to ask the question, who's the best person that could possibly ever disciple? If I'm not at the very top of that list, I shouldn't be doing this. And I feel like that's almost like asking before you have children, who's the best person that I know or in the world that, could be a father. Okay, I guess, or a mother. I guess I'm not ready then, right? And of course, if we did that, none of us would ever have children. The amazing thing is God gives us children way before, we're really the most mature at this. And now that my 5th child is almost an adult, April and I often, joke that now we're ready to become parents. So I think that it's really important that we dive into this and encourage others to dive into the process of imparting what we have. And we're going to talk about, some of the ways that we can encourage each other to do this in a way that isn't falling prey for this sort of level of professional expectation. Another one that I think is something that we resist at in Life on Life is a one size fits all curriculum. This is extremely tempting. Um, I'm going to talk a little bit in the 10 distinctives about why we don't do this. But there are so many disciple making resources booklets, books, things that, and so however you disciple people, they're likely going to disciple others. And so there's a lot of using kind of out of the box curriculums for disciple making. So we'll talk a little bit about how we think about those. But that's one of the things that we resist in this blueprint. Another one is blueprints designed by full-time professionals. So I talk to a lot of pastors, and oftentimes they will disciple in a way that works for their schedule and at a level of intensity that they can sustain as a full-time pastor. The problem is, like I mentioned, how you've been discipled is how you're going to disciple. And so oftentimes it's a very transformational experience for the disciplee, for the apprentice, but the blueprint itself is just unrealistic for the non-professional person who has a very full and busy life. And so oftentimes these blueprints collide. And so what might work for somebody who's in full-time ministry that same blueprint may not be sustainable for the person that they're hoping will replicate this. And of course, we're trying to get to the fourth generation. This has got to work for a lot of people. Another one is underestimating the multiplication problem. This is something we're going to talk a lot about during the cohort. It's extremely difficult, and I mentioned that there are forces uniquely sterilizing the multiplication of disciples in our context, in our culture. And so we take the multiplication problem in the West extremely seriously. And a lot of the blueprint and a lot of what we're going to talk about is how do you get the seed in the fruit? I think Dennis, you're the one who said something about like making seedless grapes. I love that analogy. Yeah. So we do
Yep.
do that a lot. We inadvertently make seedless grapes, and so we need to, as Genesis 1 says over and over again, God emphasizes in the creation account when he created everything, he put the seed in the fruit. He put the seed in, and so many disciple making it's exceptionally tricky to put the seed in the fruit in our culture. We're going to talk about why we can overcome it. We believe that, by working together and have some coaching and a thoughtful blueprint, we can fix this problem, but we take it very seriously. Another major mistake that we see in a lot of disciple making in the West is not clarifying the high bar up front. So when we invite somebody to follow us as we follow Christ, to be discipled, we need to raise a high bar on day one. If you beg people to join your disciple making process, if you make lots and lots of exceptions, if you communicate that this is something that you will endlessly bend or do anything to help them become a part of this process and keep the bar really, really low in order to get people to say yes, then that's going to kind of compromise the entire process. Disciple making is a high challenge, high bar process. And we cannot lower the bar and think that we're going to get the fruit, let alone multiplication of that fruit. So this is a mistake that we're going to be talking a lot about as well. Another one that I run into a lot is thinking that some other ministry that's not really designed to multiply disciples can replace disciple making. Probably the best example of that is small groups. So there's a problem that happens in churches that was discovered and very deeply investigated over the last 20 or 30 years, especially, and that is that pastors discovered that if new parishioners, new attendees of a worship service or a church do not form 2 to 3 meaningful relationships within the first 6 months, they will leave out the back door of the church. And so, in trying to solve this problem, churches all over the world have adopted small group ministries to close the back door and help people form meaningful relationships. And most of these small group ministries are designed around peer groups, finding friends, really. And it does work. And if you're going to have a worship service, then you really do need to pair that worship service with a dynamic small group ministry. Otherwise, people will flow right out of the worship service to the next church until they find some friends or some relationships. People need to be connected. There's a huge problem with this strategy, though, if you believe that it's going to replace disciple making. First of all, peer relationships are the opposite of what we're going to be describing as disciple making, where it's clear that there's a disciple maker and an apprentice. And so that oftentimes violates the design of many small group ministries. Small group ministries oftentimes will suffer from an aggressive multiplication strategy, whereas disciple making is it's critical for there to be aggressive multiplication. There's a lot of tension between these two strategies. They can overlap, but they don't overlap very naturally. And nine times out of 10, a church will default to what's best for small group ministry over what's best for disciple making, which is totally fine. And I actually believe that's the best route to go. I just think you can't call it discipleship. You have to separate these ideas. And so we're going to talk about that as well. And then the next one is not tracking the fruit. So we're going to, everyone, if you guys get involved in this and really deeply commit to the blueprint that we're going to be presenting to you over the next 3 months, then we want to spend the next 5 to 10 years tracking what happens with your disciple making movement. Our hope for every person that's going through the cohort is not that you would make disciples, but that you would, each of you, start a disciple making movement. That if we look 5, 10 years from now, will be affecting hundreds or thousands of people. That's very possible. And that's why we have to design this very carefully from the very beginning, because that's what we're after. But we need to actually track that and see. There's a lot of people talk about discipleship as if, if if one person disciples 2 people, those 2 people disciple 2 people, and on and on and on. If you do the math, the whole world will be discipled in 30 years, right? That's just simple exponential curve. But that doesn't happen. Why not? Because we don't actually discover that in much of that simple math, there's so many things that degrade the multiplication effort. And if we don't track, we can't find those things and fix them. And so we really want you guys to help us figure out how to improve this blueprint. Like, we don't believe this is done. We don't think we've cracked every code. We believe this is working, and we're going to talk about some of the distinctives in a minute. But man, we need to be really hard on the data, and we're gonna try to do that together. So that's one of the things that just 1,000 Houses as a organization is very committed to. As a ministry, we want to be tracking the fruit, and so we want to stay connected to you guys for the long term and see how many of you through your disciple making efforts are actually seeing a movement start, not just some one-off growth happen. So those are the top 10. Oh, last one, and this is, I think, something I'm really excited for us to figure out is we've got to celebrate the fruit. So you will only really get people to commit to things that over the long term that are being lifted up and celebrated. And I don't know when the last time you've been to an event that celebrates discipleship or disciple making that describes the kind of transformation that's happening. We have to pull off these kinds of events. Our family is really committed to doing this every single year, bringing together people that are making disciples in our city. So if you guys are in Cincinnati, we'd love for you guys to be a part of that. But I really believe we have to figure this out. And it's another thing that 1,000 Houses wants to help you guys figure out how to celebrate this. And that, I think, is part of what's going to create more of a citywide movement as opposed to something that's very isolated.